The soft hum of the car engine faded as Ethan's family pulled into the driveway of their new home. The weathered two-story house sat on the corner of a quiet street in the heart of the Midwest. Unlike the vibrant, sunlit neighborhoods of California that Ethan had grown up in, this town felt cold, distant. The trees lining the streets were stripped bare by winter, and the gray sky seemed to mirror the unease in Ethan's chest. "This is it," his father said with forced cheerfulness as he turned off the car. Ethan remained silent, clutching his backpack tightly. He watched his mother step out and start directing the movers with nervous energy. His younger sister, Sophia, bounced out excitedly, oblivious to the weight that had settled on Ethan's shoulders. For her, this was a new adventure. For Ethan, it felt like stepping into a storm with no umbrella. The family had moved for his dad's new job, a promotion they couldn't afford to turn down. But for Ethan, it meant leaving behind everything he knew: his best friends, the beaches, the lively streets of California, and even the small corner cafe where he used to spend hours practicing card tricks. Here, everything seemed unfamiliar, strange, empty. The first day of school came too quickly. Ethan stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his hoodie for the third time. He glanced at the clock, just 10 more minutes before they had to leave. His stomach churned with anxiety. He thought about what it would be like to walk into a room full of strangers, their eyes boring into him, judging him. His mother's voice called from downstairs, "Ethan, time to go." He grabbed his bag and headed down, trying to steady his breathing. The school building loomed large and intimidating. Its brick facade seemed darker in the overcast light, and the sound of the bell echoing through the halls only heightened Ethan's nervousness. As he stepped inside, the noise of bustling students swirled around him, groups chatting, lockers slamming, laughter ringing out. He kept his head down, trying to navigate the maze of hallways to his first class. By lunch, Ethan had hoped to find at least one friendly face. Instead, he found himself sitting alone at the edge of the cafeteria, his tray untouched in front of him. The food didn't feel appetizing. He had packed a meal his mom made, a container of chicken adobo, a dish that reminded him of home. But the moment he opened it, a snide voice cut through the air. "Ew, what is that smell?" A boy across the table said, wrinkling his nose. Ethan looked up and saw a group of kids staring at him, led by Chase, a tall, confident boy with an air of smugness. Chase leaned closer, his voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. "What is that? Did you bring garbage for lunch?" It's chicken adobo," Ethan stammered, his voice barely audible. "Chicken what?" "Sounds disgusting," Chase said with a laugh, nudging one of his friends, who quickly joined in. "What's wrong? Couldn't bring a burger like a normal person." Ethan's face burned as he quickly closed the container, feeling the sting of embarrassment crawl up his neck. He tried to ignore them, but Chase wasn't done. "What's next? Are you going to pull out some weird drink? Oh, wait, let me guess. You probably eat with chopsticks, too," Chase sneered, mimicking exaggerated movements with his hands. The laughter grew louder. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. He could feel his hands shaking as he grabbed his tray and quickly stood up, retreating to the nearest trash can to dump his lunch. The rest of the day was no better. Chase and his friends seemed to find new ways to mock him at every opportunity. They teased him about his clothes, his quiet nature, even the way he walked. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan felt like he was suffocating. He hurried out of the building, pulling his hood up over his head as he walked home. That evening, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the unopened boxes stacked against the wall. His mom knocked softly before stepping in, her face lined with concern. "How was your first day, honey?" she asked. "It was fine," Ethan replied quickly, not meeting her gaze. He didn't have the energy to tell her the truth, that he felt like an outsider, a target, a nobody. Instead, he pulled out his deck of cards, shuffling them absently in his hands. The smooth, familiar motion gave him a sense of comfort, a small piece of his old life that he could still hold on to. As he practiced a simple trick, making a card disappear and reappear, Ethan's mind wandered. He thought about the kids at school, their laughter ringing in his ears. He wondered if he would ever fit in here, in this town where everything about him seemed to stand out. The thought made his chest tighten. "Maybe tomorrow will be better," he whispered to himself, though deep down, he wasn't sure he believed it. Ethan trudged home that afternoon, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his small frame. The echoes of laughter and mocking voices followed him like shadows, each one digging deeper into his chest. The familiar sight of his house, its pale shutters, the little patch of grass his mom had tried to decorate with potted plants, did little to comfort him. He climbed the steps, pushed open the door, and slipped inside, unnoticed. Upstairs, in the solitude of his room, Ethan dropped his bag to the floor and sat on the edge of his bed. He stared blankly at the window, the overcast sky outside mirroring the storm brewing in his heart. He felt like a stranger, not just in this new town, but in his own skin. His fists clenched as he replayed the scene in the cafeteria, the jeers, and Chase's smug face. Why did he always feel so out of place? His eyes wandered to the boxes stacked against the wall. Among them was one labeled Memories. It was hastily written in his dad's handwriting, the letters slanting awkwardly. Without thinking, Ethan walked over and opened it, sifting through the jumble of old toys, photo albums, and small trinkets until his fingers brushed against something familiar, a smooth, worn box. His chest tightened as he pulled it out. It was his deck of cards. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, cradling the box in his hands. The corners were frayed, the colors faded from years of use, but to him, it felt like holding a piece of home. He opened it, pulling out the cards one by one. They smelled faintly of his old room back in California, of lazy afternoons spent practicing tricks on the porch with his dad. His lips curved into a small, wistful smile as he remembered those moments. His dad, always patient, showing him how to shuffle the deck just right or how to make a card disappear. "It's not about the trick," his dad would say, tapping his temple. "It's about the wonder. If you can make someone forget their worries for even a second, you've done magic." Ethan shuffled the cards slowly, his fingers moving instinctively through the motions his dad had taught him. The simple rhythm of the deck sliding against his palms was soothing, a quiet reminder that there was something he was good at. He tried a basic trick, making the top card vanish and reappear under the deck. It worked. His chest swelled, just a little. The idea came to him almost like a whisper. What if I used magic? He thought about Chase, about the kids at school. He couldn't change who he was or where he came from, but maybe, just maybe, magic could help them see him differently. What if he could replace their laughter with amazement? Their mockery with applause? Ethan stood up, the deck still in his hands, his mind racing with possibilities. He wasn't sure if it would work. He wasn't even sure if he had the courage to try. But for the first time since he'd moved here, a tiny spark of hope flickered in his chest. Maybe magic was the answer. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual midday chaos, trays clattering, conversations overlapping, and laughter echoing through the large, echoey room. Ethan sat at a corner table, his back against the wall, fiddling with the deck of cards in his hands. He had been practicing tricks nonstop the night before, his fingers moving with a precision born of determination. The thought of performing them in front of someone made his stomach churn, but the idea of sitting in silence, invisible, felt even worse. He glanced around, searching for a friendly face. Across the room, a group of kids erupted into laughter, but it wasn't directed at him this time. His gaze landed on Ryan, a boy from his math class who seemed approachable, quiet, yet always wearing a kind smile. Gathering every ounce of courage, Ethan stood up and walked over, his cards clutched tightly in his slightly sweaty hands. "Hey, Ryan," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the noise. Ryan looked up, surprised. "Oh, hey, Ethan, right?" Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on the cards. Yeah. I was wondering if you wanted to see something cool." Ryan tilted his head, curious. "Sure, what is it?" Ethan took a deep breath, sliding into the seat across from him. He placed the deck on the table, his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled. A small crowd of nearby students turned to watch, their curiosity piqued. "Okay, pick a card," Ethan said, spreading the deck in a smooth arc across the table. Ryan reached out and picked one, a 6 of hearts, and showed it to the small group forming around them. "Got it?" Ethan asked. Ryan nodded. "Great. Now put it back in the deck." Ryan slid the card back, and Ethan expertly shuffled, his movements gaining confidence as he got into the rhythm of the trick. "Now watch closely," Ethan said, his voice steadying. "Your card is gone." He spread the deck again, and sure enough, the six of hearts was missing. The small group leaned in, intrigued. Ethan smiled, his nerves easing as he basked in their attention. Then, with a snap of his fingers, he reached behind Ryan's ear and pulled out the card. And here it is! Ryan's eyes widened in amazement. Whoa, how did you do that? The group broke into murmurs of surprise and applause. For a moment, Ethan felt a warm rush of pride. He had done it. He had made them notice him, not as the quiet kid, not as the outsider, but as someone who could make them smile. But before he could bask in the moment, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. Oh, please, Chase scoffed, stepping closer with his trademark smirk. It's just a dumb card trick. Anyone can do that. Ethan froze, his confidence wavering. Chase grabbed the deck from the table and fanned it out mockingly. Look, everyone, I'm a magician now, he said, making exaggerated motions and pretending to pull cards out of thin air. His friends laughed loudly, their jeers drowning out the murmurs of admiration Ethan had worked so hard to earn. Ethan's cheeks burned as Chase tossed the deck back onto the table. Nice try, Magic Boy, Chase said with a sneer. Maybe next time, you can pull a personality out of that deck. The group dissolved. The fleeting moment of excitement snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Ethan sat there, his hands hovering over the scattered cards, unsure of what to do. Ryan gave him a small, apologetic smile. I thought it was cool, he said softly before walking away. But the damage was done. Ethan's chest felt tight as he gathered the cards, each one a painful reminder of his failure. He shoved them back into the box and slipped it into his pocket, avoiding the stares of the remaining students. As he walked back to his lonely table, Chase's laughter still echoed in his ears, louder than the sound of his own thoughts. For the rest of lunch, he sat in silence, staring at his untouched tray. Whatever spark of confidence he'd felt earlier had been extinguished, replaced by a heavy sense of doubt. Maybe Chase was right. Maybe magic wasn't enough. The faint shuffle of cards filled Ethan's room as he practiced a new trick for the 100th time. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to perfect the sleight of hand. The cards flicked and spun between his fingers, a rhythm that had become both a comfort and an escape from the weight of school. Outside his door, the muffled sounds of his family's evening routine carried on. The clatter of dishes, his mom's hum as she cleaned, and the low murmur of the TV. But none of it reached Ethan. He was lost in his own world, one where magic still felt like a possibility. Ethan! His father's voice broke through the silence, sharp and stern. Ethan flinched, a card slipping from his grasp and fluttering to the floor. Before he could gather it, the door swung open, and his father stood there, arms crossed, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. Still with those cards? His dad asked, stepping inside. You've been in here all night. Don't you have homework? Ethan hesitated, avoiding his father's gaze. I finished it earlier, he mumbled, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. His father sighed, stepping further into the room. Ethan, we need to talk. He motioned for Ethan to sit on the bed, but Ethan stayed on the floor, clutching the deck of cards as if it were a shield. You've been spending too much time on this magic stuff. It's not practical. It's a hobby, sure, but it's not a career. Ethan's chest tightened. He had been expecting this conversation, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. It's not just a hobby, Dad, he said quietly, his voice trembling. It's what I'm good at. It makes me happy. His father knelt down, his tone softening. I know it does, Ethan, but happiness isn't enough. You're 14. You need to think about your future. College, a stable job, a career. Magic won't pay the bills. Ethan felt a flicker of frustration. Why does everything have to be about money? You always say you hate your job, but you still do it. Why can't I choose to do something I actually love? His father's jaw tightened and he stood up abruptly. That's not the point, Ethan. I work hard because it's my responsibility to provide for this family. You're still a kid. You don't understand what it means to have that kind of pressure. Magic is fun, but it's not real life. The words stung, and Ethan scrambled to his feet, clutching the deck of cards tightly. It's real to me. You don't get it. You never have. You just want me to be like everyone else, to fit into this perfect little box you've built for me. His father's eyes narrowed. Watch your tone, Ethan. Before either of them could say more, Ethan's mom appeared in the doorway, her hands on her hips. "What's going on in here?" she asked, her gaze darting between the two of them. "Your son thinks he's going to be the next David Copperfield," his father said with a bitter laugh, throwing up his hands. "He's wasting his time instead of focusing on his future." Ethan turned to his mom, his voice breaking. "Why can't you both just support me? I'm not asking for much. I just want to be myself." His mom's expression softened, but she didn't side with him. "Ethan, we just want what's best for you. Your dad's not wrong. You have so much potential, but magic, it's not a plan." Ethan's heart sank. "Maybe I don't want your plan," he whispered before grabbing his cards and retreating to his bed. He turned his back to them, unwilling to let them see the tears pooling in his eyes. His parents exchanged a glance but said nothing more. His father sighed heavily and left the room, muttering something about responsibility under his breath. His mom lingered for a moment before closing the door gently behind her. Alone once more, Ethan stared at the cards in his hands, his vision blurry. He didn't know how to make them understand. All he knew was that magic wasn't just a hobby. It was his escape, his identity, the one thing that made him feel like he belonged. But now, even that felt fragile, teetering under the weight of their disapproval. It was a rainy afternoon when Ethan first saw the flyer. He had been walking home from school, his hood pulled tightly over his head as the drizzle soaked through his jacket. His gaze was fixed on the cracked sidewalk, each step heavy with the weight of another long, uneventful day. Then something bright caught his eye. A neon poster taped to a light pole flapped in the wind, its bold letters screaming for attention. "America's Talent Quest. Grand prize, $1 million. Think you've got what it takes? Auditions open this weekend." Ethan stopped, his breath hitching. He read the words over and over, his heart pounding in his chest. $1 million. He could barely wrap his mind around the figure. But more than the money, the idea of showcasing his magic on a national stage sent a thrill through him. He imagined himself standing under the spotlight, the audience cheering as he performed trick after trick. For the first time in weeks, the heavy cloud hanging over him seemed to lift. That evening, Ethan sat at the dinner table, clutching the flyer like a lifeline. His mom was dishing out stew while his dad scrolled through his phone. Sophia, his younger sister, was happily humming a tune as she played with her food. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the routine silence. "I want to enter this," he said, sliding the flyer across the table. His dad glanced at it briefly, then snorted. "A talent show? Ethan, come on. Be serious." "I am serious," Ethan said firmly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "This isn't just some random contest. The winner gets $1 million. And it's not just about the money. This could be my chance to prove that magic isn't a waste of time." His mom sat down, her brows furrowing as she picked up the flyer. "Ethan, this is a big deal. Do you really think you're ready for something like this?" "I've been practicing every day," Ethan insisted. "I know I can do it. I just need a chance." His dad put down his phone, looking at Ethan with a mix of concern and exasperation. "Ethan, you can't pin your future on something like this. What if you don't win? What then? Magic won't suddenly become a career just because you're good at it." "But what if I do win?" Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "Why can't you believe in me just this once?" The room fell silent. Sophia looked between her parents and Ethan, sensing the tension. Ethan's mom exchanged a look with his dad, her expression softening. "What happens if you don't win, Ethan?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated, his confidence wavering for a moment. "If I don't win, I'll stop. I'll focus on school, just like you want. But please, let me try." His dad sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Fine, you can audition, but if you don't make it, that's it. No more magic. Deal?" Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. "Deal." That night, Ethan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The stakes were high, higher than anything he'd ever faced. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope burning brightly within him. This was his shot, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The morning of the audition was wrapped in a nervous haze. Ethan barely slept the night before, his mind replaying every trick, every movement, every possible way things could go wrong. His cards, neatly stacked in a small pouch, rested on his desk alongside a few other props he'd prepared. The thought of stepping onto a stage made his stomach churn, but he reminded himself of what was at stake. This was more than just a performance. It was his chance to prove himself, to silence the doubts that had haunted him for months. "Ethan, are you ready?" his mom called from downstairs. He took a deep breath, grabbing his pouch and slipping it into his bag. "Coming!" he shouted, trying to sound more confident than he felt. As he walked downstairs, his dad stood by the door, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Ethan's mom gave him an encouraging smile, squeezing his shoulder. "Good luck, honey," she said softly. Ethan nodded, but the lump in his throat made it hard to respond. The auditorium was packed with contestants and their families, the air buzzing with excitement and tension. Ethan clutched his bag tightly as he found a seat near the back, his eyes darting around the room. Some kids were practicing dance moves, others rehearsing lines or warming up their voices. A boy nearby was juggling flaming batons. Ethan felt a pang of intimidation. "What am I even doing here?" he thought, his hands sweating. "Contestant 172, Ethan Hayes," a voice called over the speakers. His heart leapt into his throat. He stood on shaky legs, gripping his bag as he made his way to the stage. The lights were blinding as he stepped onto the platform, his breath catching at the sight of the judges sitting in a neat row below. They stared up at him, their faces expectant but blank, offering no encouragement. Hi," Ethan stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat, his hands fumbling as he set up his first trick. "I'm Ethan, and I'm a magician." The judges didn't react. A few people in the audience murmured softly, their whispers barely audible over the sound of his pounding heartbeat. He started with a basic card trick, pulling out a deck and shuffling it with trembling hands. His fingers slipped, and a few cards fluttered to the floor. The murmurs grew louder, and a wave of panic surged through him. I've got it," he said, forcing a nervous laugh as he bent down to pick them up. His face burned with embarrassment, but he pressed on, determined not to let his nerves ruin everything. After a rough start, Ethan began to find his rhythm. He moved into his second trick, a disappearing coin routine. With a snap of his fingers, the coin vanished from his palm, only to reappear in a judge's pocket. The crowd murmured in surprise, a few scattered claps breaking the silence. Encouraged, Ethan transitioned into his final trick. From his bag, he pulled out a plain white handkerchief and held it up for the audience to see. "Sometimes, the simplest things can be the most magical," he said, his voice steadier now. He waved his hands over the handkerchief, muttering a few nonsensical magic words. Slowly, the handkerchief began to transform, changing colors and growing longer until it became a dazzling silk ribbon that stretched across the stage. The audience gasped, and for the first time, Ethan heard genuine applause. He smiled, relief washing over him as he took a small bow. The judges whispered among themselves, their expressions neutral. The results were announced an hour later. Ethan sat in the auditorium, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as the judges called out the names of the contestants moving on to the next round. One by one, names were read, and the audience erupted into cheers for each lucky performer. But Ethan's name never came. When the final name was called, his chest felt hollow. The applause for the winners sounded distant, almost muted, as he stared at the floor. He barely remembered walking off the stage or gathering his things. His mom's gentle voice tried to console him as they drove home, but the ache in his chest was too loud to hear her words. That night, Ethan sat in his room, staring at his deck of cards. They felt heavier in his hands, like they carried the weight of his failure. He thought about the faces in the crowd, the judges, the other contestants. He thought about Chase's mocking words, his dad's skepticism, and the deal he had made with his parents. The spark of magic he once felt now seemed dim, almost extinguished. With trembling hands, he packed the cards back into their box and placed them at the bottom of his desk drawer. As he shut the drawer, he whispered to himself, "Maybe they were right. Maybe this isn't meant for me." For the first time, Ethan truly considered giving up on magic. The days after the audition were quiet in the Hayes household. Ethan moved through the motions of his routine like a ghost, his mind clouded with the sting of failure. The deck of cards he once carried everywhere now sat untouched in the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden from sight like a wound he didn't want to acknowledge. His parents noticed the change, but gave him space, unsure of how to reach him. One evening, as Ethan sat in his room staring blankly at his homework, his dad wandered into the den where the family computer sat. On the desk lay a crumpled piece of paper, a draft of Ethan's college essay. Curious, his dad picked it up and began reading. As he scanned the words, a lump formed in his throat. To me, success isn't about money or fame. It's about bringing joy to others. When I perform magic, I see the way people's eyes light up, the way their worries fade for just a moment. Magic has taught me that the greatest gift we can give is happiness. My dream isn't just to be a magician. It's to make people smile, to inspire them, even if it's just for a little while. That, to me, is what success truly means. By the time he finished, Ethan's dad sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always thought of magic as a frivolous hobby, a distraction. But now he realized how much it meant to his son, how deeply it was tied to who Ethan was. He sat there for a long moment, the paper still in his hands, before calling for his wife. "Look at this," he said softly, handing her the essay. She read it, her brow furrowing as her eyes moved over the words. When she finished, she looked at her husband, her expression softening. "We need to talk to him," she said. "I think we've been too hard on him." Later that evening, as Ethan lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, there was a knock on his door. His parents stepped in, his dad holding the crumpled essay. Ethan sat up, confused. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice wary. His dad sat beside him on the bed, holding up the paper. "I found this on the desk. Ethan, why didn't you show this to us?" Ethan shrugged, his gaze falling to his hands. "What's the point? You don't care about magic. You've made that pretty clear." His dad sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. I haven't been fair to you. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was wrong." Reading this, he paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Ethan. Not because you're a magician, but because of what magic means to you and what it allows you to give to others." Ethan looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "You mean that?" His mom chimed in, sitting on his other side. "We both do. And if magic is what makes you happy, then we'll support you. But you have to promise us one thing. Never give up on yourself." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a spark reignite in his chest. He nodded, tears threatening to spill. "I promise." The next morning, Ethan woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He pulled out his cards for the first time since the audition, shuffling them with steady hands. The familiar rhythm brought a small smile to his face. He spent hours practicing, perfecting tricks he'd abandoned, and even experimenting with new ones. But this time, he had a different idea. Instead of performing for an audience in person, he decided to share his magic online. He borrowed his mom's phone and set up a small corner in his room as a makeshift studio. Using a stack of books as a tripod, he recorded himself performing a simple card trick. The camera wobbled slightly, and the lighting wasn't great, but it didn't matter. He was doing what he loved. After editing the clip with free software, Ethan uploaded it to YouTube with a simple title, "Magic Trick That Will Blow Your Mind." He didn't expect much, but within hours, the video had a handful of views. By the next day, it had climbed to a few dozen. Ethan couldn't believe it. Strangers were commenting, leaving messages like, "Wow, that's amazing," and "Can't wait to see more." Encouraged, Ethan began uploading regularly. Each video was a little better than the last. Smoother tricks, improved lighting, more creative ideas. He even started sharing short clips on TikTok, where they gained traction surprisingly fast. People loved his enthusiasm and the way his tricks seemed to bring joy to everyone watching. One afternoon, as Ethan filmed a new video, his dad peeked into the room. He leaned against the doorframe, watching silently as Ethan performed a trick for the camera, his movements precise and confident. When Ethan noticed him, he paused, the cards midair. "Don't stop," his dad said with a small smile. "You look like you're doing great." Ethan grinned, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time, he felt like his family was truly behind him. The path ahead was still uncertain, but now he knew he wasn't walking it alone. Magic was more than a dream. It was his gift to the world, and he was ready to share it. Ethan refreshed the page again, staring at the number under his latest YouTube video. His jaw dropped. 10,000 views. Just a week ago, he had been thrilled with a few hundred. Now, his channel was picking up momentum, with every upload gaining more likes, shares, and comments. People from all over the world were leaving encouraging words. "Your tricks are amazing. This is the kind of joy I needed today. Keep it up. You're going places." The spark Ethan had reignited in his room had now grown into a flame. His TikTok account was even more explosive. Short, snappy videos of his tricks were gaining thousands, no millions of views. A video of him turning a handkerchief into a live goldfish had gone viral overnight, catapulting his following to over 1 million. Ethan could barely keep up with the notifications. Before long, opportunities began to roll in. Small local brands reached out, asking if Ethan could showcase their products in his magic tricks. He agreed, weaving their logos or items seamlessly into his performances. A simple trick, where he made a company's water bottle vanish, gained the brand thousands of new followers, and they paid him generously for the exposure. "Ethan," his mom said one morning, holding up her phone, "you got an email from, what's this? A talent agency?" Ethan took her phone, his hands trembling as he read the message. A national talent agency wanted to sign him for live performances and brand collaborations. They had seen his videos and were impressed by his ability to connect with audiences. He could barely believe it. Over the next few months, Ethan's life transformed. The shy boy who had once been mocked for his lunch in the cafeteria was now performing on grand stages and dazzling audiences with his unique blend of magic and charisma. One of his biggest breakthroughs came when a well-known event organizer invited him to perform at a charity gala. The stage was enormous, the room filled with celebrities, philanthropists, and media personalities. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he walked onto the stage, but as soon as he began, the nerves melted away. Under the spotlight, Ethan's tricks felt almost otherworldly. He pulled silk ribbons from thin air, made coins float above the audience, and, for his grand finale, produced a live dove from an empty hat. The audience erupted into applause, and Ethan took a bow, his heart swelling with pride. Back at home, his family watched every event through live streams or videos sent by fans. His mom kept a scrapbook of his accomplishments, filling it with screenshots of his viral moments and articles written about him. His dad, once skeptical of Ethan's path, now beamed with pride every time someone asked about his son. "I always knew he had something special," his dad said one evening as they watched Ethan's latest performance on TV. Ethan overheard from the kitchen, a warm smile spreading across his face. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for his growing success, but for the support of the family who had once doubted him. He had turned his passion into a career, proving to himself and everyone else that magic wasn't just a hobby. It was his calling, and he was just getting started. The auditorium was alive with excitement. Laughter and applause echoed off the walls as Ethan moved through the crowd, his deck of cards in one hand and a mischievous smile on his face. He was the star performer at a charity event benefiting local schools, and the room was packed with students, parents, and teachers. For Ethan, these events had become second nature. With every trick, every amazed gasp, he felt like he was giving back, making up for the years when he felt invisible. As he made his way to the next group, a voice stopped him in his tracks. "Ethan?" He turned, his heart skipping a beat. There, standing awkwardly near the edge of the room, was Chase. The same Chase who had mocked him mercilessly during those lonely days in middle school. Time had changed him. His face was more angular, his shoulders broader, but there was no mistaking the boy who had once made Ethan feel so small. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his fingers tightening around the cards. Memories of Chase's cruel laughter flickered in his mind. But before he could speak, Chase raised his hands defensively. "Hey, I'm not here to cause trouble," Chase said, his voice softer than Ethan remembered. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I mean it," Chase continued, stepping closer. "I was a jerk back then. I thought making fun of people made me look cool, but it didn't. It just made me a bully. And I'm sorry for everything I put you through." For a moment, Ethan didn't know what to say. The anger and hurt he had carried for so long seemed to dissolve in the sincerity of Chase's words. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Thanks, Chase. That means a lot." Chase looked relieved, but there was still a hint of awkwardness in his expression. "It's amazing to see how far you've come," he added. "You're incredible. I've seen your videos, and, well, I'm just glad you didn't let people like me stop you." Ethan smiled, his grip on the cards loosening. "I appreciate that. You know, it hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't change a thing. An idea sparked in Ethan's mind. He fanned out his deck of cards and held them out toward Chase. "Want to pick a card? I'll show you a trick." Chase chuckled nervously but played along, pulling out a card, the King of Hearts. Ethan took it back, shuffled it into the deck, and grinned. "Now, keep your eyes on me." Ethan began his routine, his hands moving with practiced precision. Cards flew and vanished, reappearing in impossible places. For his finale, he waved his hand over the deck, and with a flourish, pulled out Chase's card. But this time, the King of Hearts had transformed, its face replaced with a drawing of Chase himself, wearing a crown. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause as Chase stared at the card, stunned. "How did you?" he began, but Ethan only winked. "It's magic," Ethan said simply, handing him the card. "Keep it, a little reminder of how people can change." Chase looked at the card, then back at Ethan, his expression softening. "Thanks, Ethan, for everything." As Chase walked away, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Forgiving Chase wasn't just about letting go of the past, it was about proving to himself that he had truly moved on. And as he turned back to the crowd, ready for his next trick, he knew his magic had done more than entertain. It had healed. The sterile scent of antiseptic lingered in the air as Ethan entered the pediatric wing of the hospital. The walls were painted with cheerful murals of animals and flowers, but the atmosphere felt heavy. Parents sat in quiet corners, their faces lined with worry, while children lay in their beds, their movements slow, their energy sapped. Ethan's heart tightened at the sight, but he was here for a reason, to bring a little light into a place overshadowed by uncertainty. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming," a nurse said, her voice soft but grateful. "The kids are so excited. It's been a while since they had something fun to look forward to." Ethan smiled warmly and adjusted the small bag slung over his shoulder. "It's my pleasure. Let's give them a little magic." The nurse led him to a small activity room where a group of children was gathered, some in wheelchairs, others clutching stuffed animals for comfort. As soon as Ethan walked in, their eyes lit up. The anticipation in the room was palpable, and Ethan could feel their curiosity, their need for distraction, for joy. He set down his bag and pulled out his deck of cards. "Hi, everyone," he said, his voice full of energy. "Are you ready to see some magic?" The children responded with enthusiastic nods, some even clapping their hands. Ethan launched into his routine, starting with a simple trick, making a coin disappear and reappear behind a little boy's ear. The boy's laughter filled the room, contagious and uplifting. Ethan moved on to more elaborate tricks, making ribbons appear from thin air and transforming a piece of paper into a butterfly that fluttered across the room. Toward the end of his performance, Ethan noticed a little girl sitting quietly in the back, her head wrapped in a soft pink scarf. She didn't smile or react like the others, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. A boy sitting next to her, who seemed to be her brother, raised his hand shyly. "Can you do a special trick for my sister?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan crouched down to their level, meeting the boy's earnest gaze. "Of course, what's her name?" "Lila," the boy said, glancing at his sister. "She hasn't smiled in a long time." Ethan's chest tightened, but he smiled warmly. "Let's see what we can do for Lila." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, empty metal box. He showed it to Lila, tapping the sides to prove it was hollow. "Do you like flowers, Lila?" he asked gently. She nodded faintly. With a flick of his wrist and a soft abracadabra, Ethan opened the box to reveal a bouquet of colorful silk flowers. Gasps of delight echoed around the room as he handed them to Lila. Her small hands reached out hesitantly, her eyes widening as she touched the soft fabric. And then, for the first time that day, a tiny, genuine smile appeared on her face. Ethan's heart swelled. After the performance, as the children were wheeled back to their rooms, the boy approached Ethan. He held his sister's hand tightly and looked up with shining eyes. "Thank you," he said. "She hasn't smiled like that in weeks. You're like real magic." Ethan crouched down again, his voice soft. "It's not the magic that made her smile. It's how much you care about her. That's the real magic." The boy's cheeks turned pink, and he grinned before leading his sister out of the room. Ethan watched them go, his chest full of a deep, overwhelming gratitude. More than the applause, more than the recognition, it was moments like these that reminded him why he loved magic. As he packed up his bag, a nurse came over, her eyes glistening. "That was wonderful, Ethan. You have no idea how much this means to them." Ethan smiled, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "I think I do," he said softly. And as he walked out of the hospital, he knew he wasn't just a magician. He was someone who could bring hope, even in the darkest places. And that was worth more than all the applause in the world. The stage lights bathed Ethan in a warm glow as he stood before a packed theater. The audience was alive with anticipation, their murmurs filling the air like a gentle hum. Ethan adjusted his sleeves, his signature deck of cards in one hand, and took a deep breath. He could see the smiles in the crowd, families, children, fans of his magic, and his own family seated in the front row, their faces radiant with pride. This moment wasn't just about the performance. It was the culmination of a journey that had taught him what success truly meant. When Ethan first began his career, he thought success was measured by numbers, views, likes, applause, and accolades. The milestones he'd achieved felt incredible, but they were fleeting. It wasn't until he started using his talent to bring joy to others, especially to those who needed it most, that he discovered the true magic of his craft. Every laugh, every look of awe, every smile on a child's face reminded him why he loved what he did. Tonight, as Ethan prepared for his final act, he reflected on the path that had brought him here. The boy who had once sat alone in a cafeteria, mocked for being different, had found his voice through magic. The boy who had been told his dreams weren't practical had proven that passion and perseverance could open doors no one thought possible. His family had been his greatest lesson in love and support. His dad, who once dismissed magic as a distraction, now beamed with pride whenever someone asked about Ethan's success. His mom, who had kept their family together through every struggle, was his biggest fan. And his sister Sophia had become his unofficial assistant, often helping him film his online content. As Ethan met their eyes in the crowd, he saw not just pride, but joy. Joy in the fact that he had stayed true to himself while honoring the values they had taught him. For Ethan, that was the greatest success of all, to reach for the stars without forgetting where he came from. The music swelled as Ethan stepped forward for his finale. He invited a child from the audience onto the stage, handing them an empty box. "This box," he said, his voice warm and steady, "represents all the dreams we're afraid to chase. But sometimes, when you believe in something enough, magic happens." He waved his hands over the box, murmuring a few magical words, and opened it to reveal a cascade of colorful butterflies fluttering into the air. The audience gasped, then burst into applause. The child on stage laughed with delight, their eyes sparkling as they looked at Ethan. Ethan bowed deeply, his heart full. As he stood upright, the spotlight caught the gleam of tears in his eyes, tears not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude. The applause roared around him, but he wasn't thinking about fame or recognition. He was thinking about the lives he had touched, the smiles he had inspired, and the love he had earned through simply being himself. After the show, Ethan stood backstage, surrounded by his family and team. His dad clapped a hand on his shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done it, son. Not just the magic, but everything. You've made us so proud." Ethan looked at them, his chest swelling with warmth. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "You believed in me. That's where the magic started." Later, as Ethan walked onto the empty stage to collect his props, he took one last look at the rows of seats now quiet and still. He smiled, not because of the applause that had filled the space earlier, but because he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Success, he realized, wasn't measured by wealth or fame. It was measured by the joy you brought to others, the lives you touched, and the love you carried with you. And for Ethan, that was a kind of magic more powerful than any trick he could ever perform. As he turned off the stage lights and walked into the night, Ethan carried that magic with him, his smile brighter than any spotlight. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of loyalty, love, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals. Join us as we share stories that remind us of what truly matters in life. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment.